Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 5th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Unless you're more righteous than a preacher, you're not going to heaven. Unless you're more righteous than the greatest preacher, you're not going to heaven. It's in the Bible. So a show of hands, who's more righteous than the greatest preacher? Yeah, that's what I thought. So how does that work exactly? How does that work? Jesus says, full adherence to the law. Full adherence. Every letter, every stroke of every letter, every stroke of every letter must be obeyed in fullness, or you don't make it. Full righteousness. And it would have been so shocking for Jesus' audience to hear this. So shocking. You have to be more righteous than the Pharisees, than the scribes, who have dedicated their entire life to obedience to God's law. I mean, their entire life, every minute of every day was focused on whether or not they were doing the right thing according to what God's law had said. Now, there were some that were no good. Don't get me wrong. Just like there's some preachers that are no good. But there were some who were incredibly faithful, incredibly dedicated. And those men had led their people, and they've been amazed by them. Their dedication and devotion to God and walking in God's light and following righteousness. And Jesus says, you've got to be more holy than them, more righteous than them, more religious than them. You've got to do it better than them if you want to go to heaven. Okay. Now, a couple of things that I think are worth noting. One, what does Jesus mean by law? That can get a little tricky, and I know that when I was a youth, and I'd hear the pastor talk about law, I would get confused. Like no trespassing? What are we talking about here? Are we talking about breaking the speed limit? I mean, is that breaking the law? I mean, every stroke of every letter. What is the law? Now, it was a little different in Jesus' time because the law, God's law, as gleaned from Scripture, and the law same thing. There was no separation of church and state. So the Pharisees, who told you how to live according to God's law, also set the civil law. So laws and how you were supposed to behave and what you could and couldn't do on Sabbath days or in preparation for Sabbath days, those weren't simply religious observances. They were also civil law that had to be followed. And you and I in America know that just because a thing is a law does not necessarily mean that it's God's law. That there's a distinction between God's law and human law. But regardless, we can't be good enough for either. I mean, just take speeding, for example. If you go over the speed limit, you are breaking the law. And I have a hunch, whether by intention or accident, that we've all done it, if you can drive. Maybe some kids who don't have driver's license have done it too. That we've all done it. That we cannot follow every law that's in the book. Lawyers can't follow every law that's in a book. And they spend their life studying and learning it. Sometimes they focus on just one law and try to make a living just interpreting and acting upon one law. It's become so complicated that you can't follow the civil law, but on the same front, Jesus says you can't follow the religious one either. You cannot be good enough for God through obedience to the law. You can't do it. Can't happen. And that is the function. Well, one of the functions of the law is to convict, to make you realize that you're just not good enough. Well, thanks, Pastor. That's what I came to church for today, is find out I'm not good enough. I value that. I needed that in my life. Somebody else who doesn't think I'm good enough. And that's why so many people, if the message stops there, why come to church? Why do the whole God thing? Why try to do the right thing? Why follow any kind of sense of morals at all if it's pointless? If it's not good enough to attain anything? If it serves no function, why obey the law at all? I mean, and some people will say that I can't even go in that building or God would strike me by lightning. I mean, you've heard it. Because they believe that you have to be a certain level of righteousness because that's what it says. You have to be the most righteous. The most righteous. And yet. Okay, so you were waiting. Okay, there's got to be another side of this, right, Pastor? Yeah, there is. Think about what Jesus says in terms of salt and light. He says, if salt, or rather, he says, you are the salt. And if salt loses its saltiness, it's no good. Throw it out. Well, have you ever had salt that lost its saltiness? I had to do some work on this. I had to look it up. Can salt lose its saltiness? Yeah, I just saw a science teacher shake her head. No. That's right. Salt is incredibly stable as a compound. It doesn't lose its taste. It doesn't happen unless it's not salt. But salt is salt, and it remains salt unless it's corrupted or not salt. Salt is salt. You can't lose its saltiness. Now perhaps, salt was, this is another historical thing. Salt was incredibly valuable in Jesus' time. Incredibly valuable. In fact, sometimes it was used as a form of currency. You would pay someone with salt. In fact, the word salary comes from the word salt. Right? So some of you are still paid by salt. The word salary comes from the word salt. That's how valuable salt has been to humanity. So sometimes it was fake salt, not real. And then maybe it loses its saltiness and all you do is throw it out because it had no function at all. But if a thing is salt, and if God calls a thing salt, which God does, God says, you are salt, and God don't lie. You are salt, so you are. You can't lose it. Doesn't work. You can't lose it. And then Jesus says, you are the light. You are the light. And if God says you are the light, then you are the light. You are the salt, and you are the light. Salt serves function in this world. It has a purpose. It's valuable, it's meaningful, and it tastes good. Light has a function and a purpose. It reveals things. It makes things known. If there was no light in this space, you could hear me, but you couldn't see me. And that's an amazing thing about light. We don't produce our own. We simply reflect the light that's around us. We reflect the light that is around us, and that is why Scripture says time and time again that Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is the light of the world, in which case you and I then are beacons of that light. And as long as there is Jesus, then there will always be beacons of hope. So you can't be righteous enough unless Jesus makes you so. Jesus says the law will be fulfilled, every stroke of it. And then Jesus says, and I'm the one to do it. The law has been fulfilled in me. We couldn't. We weren't righteous enough. We can't be. Adherence to the law, we can't do it. Jesus can. Jesus did. And then Jesus said, and now you are too. We are made righteous. We don't become righteous by following the rules and the laws and doing things that way. We become righteous when Jesus says we are. When Jesus makes us so. And how do you know if a thing is righteous? Well, it tastes salty. The salt has an effect on the world around them. You can see the light shine from them. So why would we try to hide that? Why would you try to hide it? I mean, the example Jesus gives is a time when they didn't have electricity. So you light a candle to light up the room. You then don't put a wicker basket over that. That don't end well, right? Jesus says you don't put a wicker basket over a candle. You let it shine. In fact, you lift it up and you put it on a stand for the whole world to see. Not because the light is amazing, but because it has an effect on the community around them. And Jesus says, you and I are lights. We're not called to hide. We're called to go to dark places and let the light shine so the world can see that God's at work in us. Huh? What do I do with it? Right? The light goes out. And we're called then to hold a mirror to it. To hold a mirror to it. So the world can see the brightness. Now, admittedly, man, some are blinded by it. So then we've got to give them a little light at a time. But we're called to reflect it. We don't hold it to ourselves. In fact, so often, we can't hold it to ourselves. The love of God shines through us so brightly, it has an impact on the world around us. And we're called to engage it all the more fully. To go to the places where there is hunger and feed them because we can. To go to the place where there are sick and help them, comfort the grieving because we can. We're capable of doing that. We can make a phone call and give comfort. We can go and be alongside. We can help. We can serve. We can lift people up. Sometimes we can financially support others. Sometimes they need a helping hand. Sometimes they need to know love. And when we do these things, we shine God's light all the brighter. A city on a hill can't be hidden. So let us shine. Let us shine. Not because we act righteous, but because we've been made righteous by a righteous God who loves us and indeed loves all the world and has called and commissioned us to share that love with everyone.